Just a tiny warning, this video is going to be a little bit information dense. So if you ever do feel your head hurting, then don't hesitate to take a break and beat up some hilichurls before coming back. As a brief synopsis, we'll start off with Raiden's best weapons and artifact stats. I think a lot of you will learn some very surprising things, like for example how the catch at Refinement 5 is only 2% behind her signature weapon, Engulfing Lightning, or that an energy recharge sands is actually almost always better on Raiden than an attack timepiece. After that, we'll talk about Raiden's Constellations and kit, as well as which teammates work best with her, which again are two things that are very closely related and intertwined. For those of you who are very new to Genshin, and perhaps a little bit confused, don't worry, everything will be explained in due course. All you need to keep in mind for now is that the Raiden Shogun does damage, mainly through her elemental burst. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now fortunately, the Raiden Shogun's weapon choices are pretty straightforward. As with any other 5-star, she has her own dedicated 5-star weapon, Engulfing Lightning, also known as Grass Cutter, which gives her a healthy amount of energy recharge and attack. Pretty straightforward. So let's move on to her best 4-star weapon. Coincidentally, this is also pretty open and shut. If you don't have Engulfing Lightning, you'll want to get her the Catch, which is the 4-star weapon you get from fishing in Inazuma. It's got your energy recharge substat, just like Engulfing Lightning, and not only that, it gives you a huge boost to her burst damage. This is far and away her best free-to-play weapon, so if you don't have Engulfing Lightning, or you don't plan to get it, then make absolutely sure you get the Catch. As a side note, this weapon is also very broken on Xiangling, due to the fact that Xiangling needs a lot of energy recharge, and all of her damage also comes from her burst as well. And as a side note, if you do get Engulfing Lightning for your Raiden Shogun, then you can put the Catch on Xiangling, so it all works out. And if you don't have the Catch, well, you should get the Catch. Yeah, it's really that good. Nothing even comes remotely close. Now there will be a much more in-depth and technical analysis of these two weapons later in the video. I'll also talk about alternatives like Skyward Spine and Wavebreaker's Fin, but for now, let's take a quick look at Raiden's artifact set and stats. So once again, the Raiden Shogun has pretty much one undisputed best-in-slot artifact set, which is also, I'm pretty sure, crafted just for her. It does happen to work well on a lot of other burst-oriented characters, but it really was tailor-made for her, even the color scheme matches. And that is the Emblem of Severed Fate, or EOSF as it's often abbreviated. And looking at the 2- and 4-piece set bonuses, you can see right off the bat why it is extremely good on her. The 2-piece gives you a flat 20% energy recharge, which is always welcome, and the 4-piece will increase your burst damage based on how much energy recharge you have. As you can see, pretty much perfect synergy with the Raiden Shogun skill kit. Now, for the main stats on your headpiece/circlet, you're going to want either crit damage or crit rate, depending on which one you are lacking. For the timepiece/sands, you're going to want either energy recharge or, in extremely rare instances, attack. Pretty much always you're going to want energy recharge. You should only use an attack timepiece if the timepiece has a lot of energy recharge on it, as well as a lot of other good substats like crit rate and crit damage. But practically like 95+% of the time, you're going to want an energy recharge main stat on your timepiece. Then finally, for her goblet, you will always want electro damage, so nothing else really comes close. Even if your electro damage goblet has trash substats, just use it. Now, I do understand that a lot of players think an attack sands will be better than an energy recharge sands, especially if you already have an ER weapon, such as the Catch or Engulfing Lightning. I don't agree with this, and let me show you guys some numbers as to why that is. So firstly, let's get our baseline stats. So under this build, I do 255k damage with my burst, and I have 290% energy recharge right here. So if we switch this sands to an attack sands, then I'll only have 238, right, 239, and I will do 259k on my burst instead. That is an improvement of approximately 2%. I think that's around 2%. Let me just double check. So 259,778 divided by 255,128. I think that's right. So let's just go back to make sure. ER sands, yeah, 255,128. So that would be a damage increase of 1.8%. So think of all the situations where doing 1.8% damage would have mattered, versus all the situations where you kind of almost had your burst up, but then you didn't. Now, I'm sure there's someone out there who, if only they did like 2% more damage, they would have gotten 36 stars on the Spiral Abyss, whereas they otherwise didn't. But I really don't think that's worth it. Like, 2% more damage for 52% energy recharge. Even if you have no issues filling up your burst, this will make Raiden a whole lot more usable in the overworld. So I would say that a small sacrifice of 1 to 2% damage is definitely worth the gain of 51.8% energy recharge. So that is my rationale for why I run an ER Sands over an Attack Sands, even though the Attack Sands does technically do more damage. As for your artifact substats, you'll want to get as much crit rate and crit damage as possible. Same story as with any other damage dealer in Genshin. However, like I said before, you may want to value crit rate a little bit more than crit damage. And don't worry, I'll explain why later in the video. After that, your next priority will be energy recharge followed by attack percentage. So if your ER is less than, say, 250, you'll definitely want to get more of that. Between 250 to 300, you can give ER and attack roughly equal weighting. Beyond 300% ER, you will want to value attack over energy recharge. The reason being that the burst damage bonus you get from 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate will cap out at 300% energy recharge. Other stats beside that aren't really useful, so ideally on an artifact you want attack percentage, energy recharge, crit rate, and crit damage. The next one down would probably be flat attack or elemental mastery. So EM will be useful if you can trigger reactions like Hyper Bloom or Aggravate, which will require a Dendro character in your party. Other than that, we only really have defensive stats left, so obviously percentages are better than flats, and that's pretty much it. Now, for those of you who don't have a good set of Emblem of Severed Fate, well, you'll want to get one. Yes, it actually is that good. Nothing comes close. No 2-piece combination or any other set really comes close for the Raiden Shogun. Now again, if you are a new player, what you can use in the meantime are 2-piece sets that give you either energy recharge, burst damage, or attack. So this would be the 2-piece of Emblem of Severed Fate itself, Noblesse, as well as something like Gladiator or maybe Shimenawa. For new players, this would be something like the Exile set or maybe the Sojourner set. Again, very temporary measures until you get a 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate set. And now let's move on to her constellations. So the Raiden Shogun actually has very overpowered constellations, especially her Constellation 2. In fact, her C2 actually gives her more of a power spike than a lot of characters' C6. And what it does is it causes her attacks to ignore 60% of opponents' defense when she's in her burst state. Now for those of you who play co-op, you may have noticed that when you go to lower AR players' worlds, then you do a lot more damage. And a big reason is because as the monsters get higher level, they get more defense. And that is the main thing that reduces the damage you deal to monsters as they get higher level. So cutting enemies' defense by 60% is a huge deal, and it usually works out to around a 40 to 45% damage increase. So that is her C2. As for her C3, her other notable constellation, this will just give you 3 levels to your elemental bursts. Pretty straightforward, and that works out to usually around a 15 to 20% damage increase. Her other constellations aren't really worth getting in my opinion. I mean, you know, unless you're a whale. But I will go over them real quick. So her Constellation 4 will increase all of your other party members' attack by 30% after her burst ends, so this isn't really that good unless you're using Raiden as a support role to support another character. Her C5 is pretty much worthless, so this will increase her skill by 3 levels, but skill levels don't really do a whole lot for Raiden. Her C6 is kind of interesting, so this will reduce everybody else's burst cooldown by 1 second every time she hits with her normal attack while in her burst state. So again, this is very dependent on the rest of the party, right? And it's not really, well, it actually has no effect on Raiden herself. It just benefits her team, and the extent to which it benefits her team is pretty unclear as well. It might do quite literally nothing because there's something else holding you back. aside from the other party members' burst cooldown, or it might actually shorten your rotation by quite a bit. So the value of this is kind of indeterminate, or at least heavily depends on the specific team that you're using. Now, more importantly, let me just drive home the point of just how good her C2 and C3 are. And I guess I'll go over her Constellation 1 as well, since it's there and you have to get it to get her C2. So her C1 doesn't actually really increase her damage, it just allows her to build up her resolve stacks faster. So if you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get her full resolve stacks before using her burst, then technically C1 would increase your damage. But most of the time you shouldn't really have too much trouble filling up her resolve stacks, assuming you use her party members' bursts first. So this is effectively not too useful. But if we go down here to Constellation 2, we can see a huge damage bonus. So it was 151k and now it is 216, right? So if we get out our calculator app, so this is just the built-in calculator that Windows uses, and if we do 216 divided by 155, so I'm rounding it to the nearest thousand, that will give you a rough, oh wait, hold on, I think it was 151, right? 216 divided by 151, her C, yes, it was 151. So if we do that, that is a 43% damage bonus that she gets from going to C2. Pretty insane. I think that's more than most characters get from their C6. And then now if we check her C3, right, so go 2 and then 3, it turns into 255k. And then of course if we input that, 255 divided by 216, so that was with her C2, then that is an 18% damage bonus. And if you really want to put things in perspective, so 255 divided by 151, so that was her damage at C0 or C1, right? 151, 69%. She literally does 69% more damage going from C0 to C3. That is pretty darn insane, guys. So if you're planning to use the Raiden Shogun long term, then definitely at least get her Constellation 2. 3 if you want. I got her 3, although I'm kind of regretting it a little bit just because it makes her do a bit too much damage, and as a result you can't really use her in the overworld anymore. The reason being that she one-shots everything, and that means that she doesn't have anything left to hit to regenerate her energy to get her burst back up again. So I would personally stop at her C2, get her C3 if you really want. I would not go farther than that unless you're Whale, but to be clear, Raiden is still, as an Archon, very competitive with other characters even at Constellation 0. And while we're here, I might as well just show you guys the difference between the Catch R5 and Engulfing Lightning R1. So as we saw before, my Raiden with the Catch R5 does around 255k, right? So that is the initial hit of her burst at max resolve stacks. And if we change this to Engulfing Lightning, right, so at R5 Engulfing Lightning, it's going to be a pretty big upgrade, 297. But if we make it Refinement Rank 1, 260, right? So let's just get our calculator out. We'll be a little bit more precise this time. So 260,821 divided by, I think it was 255128. Let's just double check. Yeah, 255128. 255128. 2.2%. So she's going to do literally 2.2% more damage upgrading to Engulfing Lightning R1 from the Catch R5, which I don't need to tell you is not worth it, right? If you're going to spend additional wishes on the same character, then just get Raiden's Constellations. Now, there are two other weapons that I'll mention because a lot of people think that they're better than the Catch. To be clear, they are not. But instead of taking my word for it, I will show you guys some hard numbers to back that up. So the first one is Skyward Spine. So this is a 5-star weapon. It is on the standard banner. You can get it from there. You can also get it from losing your 50-50. Now, at Refinement Rank 5, Skyward Spine will outperform the Catch. So even though this damage number here is lower at 249k, if we scroll down, we can see that Skyward Spine will give you a 12% boost to your normal attack speed. Keep in mind that attack speed doesn't affect how much damage you deal in your initial hits, but it will make your follow-up attacks faster for the rest of Raiden's burst. So in my experience, the initial hit usually comprises about half of Raiden's burst damage, and then the attacks, normal attacks, and charged attacks that follow that are usually the other half. So we can treat this as a 6% damage increase. In that case, if we just get out our calculator, so that would be 249. Let's be a bit more precise. 780 times 1.06. So this will make Skyward Spine outperform the catch by a little, right? Recall the catch was 255. This is 264. So it's really not that significant. Even though, once again, nobody is going to have Skyward Spine at R5. I mean, if you're a whale, then you might as well get Engulfing Lightning at R5, right? So if we bump this down to Refinement Rank 1, then Skyward Spine is pretty much just worse than the catch, right? This is the most likely Refinement rank that everybody's going to have this weapon at. And yeah, it's worse than the catch R5 when it is R1. So the second weapon that is often brought up in the context of Raiden weapons is Wavebreaker's Fin. So you can see this at R1 underperforms the catch by a lot. If we bump this up to R5, it still does. Now there is one little caveat though. If we scroll down here, we can see that Wavebreaker's Fin, its power level, so to speak, will scale with the burst cost of your entire team. That is to say, if you add up the combined maximum energy capacity of your entire team, and then you multiply it by this percentage, then this weapon will increase your elemental burst damage by the result. Now I know that sounds kind of complicated, so let's use an example to illustrate exactly what this weapon does. So the Raiden Shogun's burst costs 80 energy, Kujou Sara's burst costs 80 energy, and then Bennett and Kazuha, their bursts cost 60 each. So we add all of those numbers up, so 80, 80, 60, 60, and you will get 280. And then you multiply 280 by this figure right here. So let's just do that right now. Well, let's make sure our math is correct. So 80 plus 80 plus 60 plus 60 plus 60. Okay, so that's 280. And then you multiply it by 0.24, you get 67.2. And that corresponds to this number right here. So if we select that, then we can see that this damage goes up to slightly higher than the catch. So at Refinement Rank 5, Wavebreaker's Fin will barely do more damage than the catch, right? This is 257, and then the catch is 255. And I don't really need to tell you guys that that's not worth it, because getting this 5 times is probably, well, actually, it's almost certainly harder than getting an R1 Engulfing Lightning, which does more than it, right? Again, this isn't even worth it, so Wavebreaker's Fin R5 is definitely not worth it. And of course, that means anything less than R5 makes it worse. So let's get our team energy back. Oh, wait. Okay, so it's not 67.2 now because this scales with refinement rank. So our 280 energy is multiplied by this lower number here, and it's going to be presumably 58.8. Let's just make sure of that. Pretty sure that is going to be the case. 0.21, yeah, so 58.8 because it's only R4 now. And of course, at R4, it underperforms the catch. And if that somehow still wasn't enough, then let me just drive the final nail into the coffin by reminding you guys that even if you do somehow have Wavebreaker's Fin at R5, maybe you got super lucky, right? Who knows? That this attack stat, this attack substat that the weapon gives, is already factored into the damage, which means you are losing the 45 to 46% energy recharge that the catch R5 would have given you. Now, I don't know about you guys, but even if I had no trouble at all filling up my burst energy, I would still take this 46% energy recharge over doing literally 1% more damage after getting Refinement Rank 5 of a banner weapon. So yeah, really guys, I mean, unless you want to get Engulfing Lightning just for, drip purposes because it matches Raiden's color scheme, but aside from that, don't bother with any of these other weapons. Just go with the catch R5. I guarantee you, your Raiden will be more than happy with it. Now before we get to the most important part of the video, let's have a quick crash course for new players and a very important refresher for veteran players on the Raiden Shogun skill kit. Despite her somewhat different stat scaling, the Raiden Shogun's actual kit isn't too complicated. Her elemental skill will do some electro damage in a small area, and it will also allow your active character to do electro damage on normal attacks. So with a short internal cooldown, whenever your active character does normal attacks, they will also trigger Raiden's skill and do some electro damage. Her burst is also pretty simple, so she pulls her sword out of her, dealing a huge amount of damage, and then for about 7 seconds afterwards, her normal attacks will be enhanced, they'll do electro damage, and they'll be considered burst damage. So make sure you do as much damage as you can in these 7 seconds. Oh, and 2 more small details. The more characters that use their elemental bursts before Raiden, the more damage that Raiden's burst will do, so these are called resolve stacks. Additionally, when Raiden hits things with her normal attack while in her elemental burst state, she will regenerate energy for the rest of the party. So basically you use everybody else's burst, and then you use Raiden's burst, and then her burst will help everybody else get their burst back, so you can all burst again. Fairly straightforward. Now even more important than anything we've talked about thus far are the Raiden Shogun's teammates. The reason being that, depending on which teammates you plan to pair Raiden with, you will actually want to gear her a whole lot differently. Not to mention that having the proper supports will quite literally triple your Raiden Shogun's damage. So one of the great things about the Raiden Shogun is that a lot of her damage is condensed into a pretty short window of around 7 to 8 seconds, right? That is her enhanced burst state duration. This means that Raiden Shogun's ideal team involves stacking as many buffs on her as possible that last around that time. So the best overall team for her is probably still the Raiden Shogun Hyper Carry team, which has been around for, I think, around 2 years now. So this will be the Raiden Shogun herself, plus Kujou Sara, Bennett, and Kazuha. Now obviously this isn't the only team you can use with the Raiden Shogun, but I find that it is the best in terms of a combination of damage output as well as comfort. So let's go over what each of these characters contribute to the Raiden Shogun. We'll start with perhaps the most well-known character that more players are likely to have, and that's Bennett. So he only really does 2 things. He gives the Raiden Shogun a big attack buff, and he also heals your characters when they drop below 70% HP. So he does that by using his burst, so make sure you stay in the circle of his burst if you want to get those buffs. And he's also a pretty good battery, so if you're ever just a little bit low on energy, you can swap to Bennett and use his elemental skill and get 2 particles right there. And oftentimes if Raiden's skill is active, then you'll also get an electro particle as well. So Bennett's pretty straightforward. He heals you and he boosts your attack. Next up we have Kujou Sara. Now she doesn't heal you, but she actually does a lot more to boost the Raiden Shogun's damage. Similar to Bennett, she will give you an attack buff through both her elemental burst and her elemental skill, although her elemental skill is a little cumbersome to use before Constellation 2. So if you don't have Kujou Sara at least C2, then you have to use her skill and then shoot an arrow at somewhere, and then you have to go to that somewhere and make sure you are within the explosion radius of the arrow in order to get Kujou Sara's attack buff. The other way is to use her elemental burst and make sure you swap to the character right afterwards that you want to receive the buff. So as long as Kujou Sara's burst makes contact with your character, then your character will get her buff. At Constellation 2, Sara's elemental skill becomes much easier to use. You just have to press it, and then you switch to your character, and the explosion will happen right at your feet. So to reiterate, both her burst and her skill will work. In fact, if you get enough energy recharge, you can apply Kujou Sara's burst solely by just using her ultimate, and you don't even need to touch her skill at all. Now, her other notable constellation is Constellation 6. If you get Kujou Sara to C6, then the same attack buff she grants will also grant you a 60% crit damage for electro attacks. And of course the Raiden Shogun does electro damage while in her burst state. So Kujou Sara is hands down the best offensive buffer for Raiden, as long as you have her constellations. Oh, and just a side note, the buffs that Bennett and Sara grant you are both based on their base attack. So this pretty much just means their level and the base attack of the weapon they're holding. To find a character's base attack, you just have to go into their stat details. It is this white number right here, not the number you see on their summary screen. Very important to keep in mind, attack boosting stats, for example on their artifacts or their weapon, will not increase the amount of the attack buff that they give to your other characters. Now let's move on to the fourth member of the Raiden Shogun Hypercarry team, and that is Kazuha. There are two reasons that Kazuha is a very good final team member. So number one, surprise surprise, he gives damage buff, so he will buff your team's electro damage according to his elemental mastery. So as you can see here, if for example you have 1000 elemental mastery, then your entire team gets a 40% electro damage buff when Kazuha creates an electro swirl reaction. And of course this works for any element, that's why Kazuha is such a great character in general. And on top of that, Kazuha provides very good crowd control. So his elemental skill will suck enemies in and group them together. That allows you to hit all of them at once with your Raiden's burst. He also does a pretty decent amount of damage himself, especially swirl damage if you have high elemental mastery, so definitely don't write that off. And then lastly, as with any Anemo support, he can make use of VV, Resident Veneerer. So of course, whatever element gets swirled, then anything that gets hit by that attack will have their elemental resistances cut by 40%, which again is very powerful. Now if you don't have Kazuha, then pretty much any other Anemo character will work. They won't obviously give you Kazuha's elemental damage bonus, but you will still get the crowd control, probably, and you will still get the VV buff, so Venti and Sucrose are good ones that come to mind. Another very noteworthy mention is Chevreuse. She's actually remarkably similar to Bennett, giving you an attack buff as well as being a healer. However, if you wanted to use her with a Raiden team, she would have to substitute Kazuha instead, due to her inherent limitation of only really working with Electro and Pyro characters. For that reason, in this video we're going to be comparing her directly to Kazuha, the only member of the Raiden team that she can substitute. Chevreuse can offer your Pyro and Electro characters up to a 40% attack bonus. She gives you a 40% resistance shred to Pyro and Electro attacks, and at Constellation 6, she will boost your Pyro and Electro damage by up to 60%. On the other hand, Kazuha will provide you a 40% resistance shred buff from VV, as well as a roughly 40% elemental damage bonus. Now it's starting to seem like Chevreuse is just a whole lot better than Kazuha, at least at Constellation 6. After all, she gives you 40%, or at least up to a 40% attack bonus, while giving you the same resistance shred as Kazuha and an even bigger damage buff than Kazuha. But not so fast. Aside from the fact that we are talking about Constellation 6 Chevreuse, and those of you veteran players know that getting C6 of a 4-star is a lot harder than getting C0 of a 5-star. But even putting that aside, Chevreuse does have a few more limitations that Kazuha doesn't. First and foremost, she only works with Pyro and Electro characters, and she requires your entire party to only have Pyro or Electro characters, at least one of each, so no mono teams either, while Kazuha has no such team restrictions. Another thing is that Chevreuse's resistance shred is triggered on overload rather than swirl. This means that not only will you need to have a reliable source of off-field pyro application, but you'll need to trigger overload, which isn't exactly ideal if you're fighting a lot of small enemies that can be knocked away. At the same time, Kazuha is actually ideal for gathering small enemies together, so that you can hit them all at once with your Raiden Shogun's burst. Adding to that, Chevreuse's resistance shred only lasts for 6 seconds, while Kazuha's lasts for 10 and is reapplied every time there is a swirl reaction. And since Kazuha's burst lasts for 8 seconds and stays on the field, then Kazuha's resistance shred basically lasts for 18 seconds from when you first apply it. Now this is actually very significant, especially since resistance shred can be incredibly broken depending on what kind of enemy you're fighting. Let me just give you guys an example where you're fighting an enemy with high electro resistance and Chevreuse's resistance shred runs out, while Kazuha's is still applied. So let's say your Raiden Shogun does 100,000 damage with her Muso no Hitotachi, right? So 100k ult. And then let's say you're fighting an enemy with 90% electro damage resistance. And before you say it, yes, these do exist in the game, there are a few of them, and then also a few of them that have, let's say, like 50 or 70% electro resistance and so on. But anyway, if your target has 90% electro damage resistance, then your 100k ult turns into 10k. However, if you have your 40% resistance shred, then that 90% becomes 50%, which means half of your damage will still go through. Basically, that 40% resistance shred just quintupled your damage. That is a 5x. On the other hand, let's say Chevreuse's resistance shred fell off, but she still has her bonus 40% attack and 60% damage. Now let's say that this 40% bonus attack and 60% bonus damage will double your damage, which is, I think, a bit too generous, but we'll roll with it. In this case, your initial 100k damage becomes doubled to 200, but then it gets cut by the enemy's 90% resistance. So as a result, you end up doing 20,000 damage, whereas if you had that 40% resistance shred, then you would have been able to do 50,000. So that is how insanely broken resistance shred can be, and Kazuha's is a lot better than Chevreuse's. However, like I said, if you are fighting one big enemy, so you don't care about overload knocking things back, and you have consistent off-field pyro damage, then Chevreuse will do better than Kazuha at Constellation 6. However, if you need to group enemies together, or if Chevreuse is not Constellation 6, or if you don't have consistent off-field pyro damage, then in any of those cases, Kazuha is still going to be preferable to Chevreuse, even at Constellation 0. Now let's say we do use Chevreuse and we replace Kazuha with her. In this case, Bennett is going to become kind of redundant since he also buffs attack and he heals, which Chevreuse happens to do as well. To be sure, she doesn't do either of those things as well as Bennett, but she also provides that resistance shred and damage bonus that you lost by replacing Kazuha. So if you can do without Bennett's insane healing, then the fourth team member I would use is actually Xiangling rather than Bennett. She does a lot of damage by herself, she benefits from Chevreuse's pyro resistance reduction, and her off-field pyro application is pretty darn consistent, allowing you to get those overload reactions that Chevreuse needs. So to cap it all off, the two teams I would recommend are the standard Raiden hypercarry team with Raiden herself, Kujou Sara, Bennett, and Kazuha. If instead you want to use Chevreuse instead of Kazuha, then the team becomes Raiden, Kujou Sara, Chevreuse, and Xiangling. Now, of course, these are just my opinions, and they're not any kind of hard rules that you need to follow. As long as your Raiden is getting plenty of buffs, and of course, if you use Chevreuse, you are using the correct team members, that is to say Pyro and Electro characters, then pretty much anything should be viable on account of how overpowered the Raiden Shogun is. Okay, so at this point, I'm sure many of you have already figured out why a 1-to-2 crit rate to crit damage ratio on your artifacts isn't actually ideal for Raiden. And the reason is that Raiden gets a lot of external sources of crit rate and crit damage aside from her artifacts. So if you use the catch, she will get an additional 12% crit rate that isn't displayed on your stat screen since it only applies to elemental bursts. And if you use Kujou Sara, she will get an additional 60% crit damage that also isn't displayed on your stat screen since it is electro damage only. So this means if you are using the catch and you are not using Kujou Sara C6, then you'll want to slightly favor crit damage over crit rate. If on the other hand you are using Kujou Sara C6 but not the catch, then you will want to heavily favor crit rate. And of course, if you're using both, that is to say you're getting an additional 12% crit rate and 60% crit damage from external sources, then you will want to also favor crit rate, albeit a bit less heavily so. This may sound obvious to some people, but when I'm in co-op I see a lot of Raiden Shoguns that have like nearly 200% crit damage and then like less than 50% crit rate. That is not good, guys, unless you are going for damage per screenshot. If you have or are planning to use C6 Kujou Sara, you will want at least something like 70% crit rate to match all of that crit damage you're getting. So if you look at my stats here, right, it seems at first glance that I have too much crit rate, or put it another way, not enough crit damage. But if you were to add up the stats that I get from the Catch R5 as well as Kujou Sara C6, then this crit rate here becomes 86.6, so 74.6 plus 12, while my crit damage becomes 188.5. Basically all I'm saying is that if you have Kujou Sara at Constellation 6, which should be a goal if you don't already have it, then you will want to value crit rate over crit damage, even if you do have the 12% crit rate from the catch, and especially if you don't. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's move on to the relatively simpler second way in which the Raiden Shogun is different from a typical main DPS/carry. And that is that she gains both bonus electro damage as well as additional recharge for her teammates from energy recharge. So if you look here, every 1% additional energy recharge will give the Raiden Shogun 0.6% energy restoration from Musou Ishin and 0.4% electro damage. So if you have 300% energy recharge, that is to say 200 more than the default 100%, then your teammates will restore more than twice. They'll restore 120% more energy from Musou Ishin, and the Raiden Shogun will get 80% more electro damage. So you can kind of see why energy recharge is such an important stat for the Raiden Shogun, not to mention that she'll get plenty of sources of attack from Kujou Sara and Bennett and maybe now Chevreuse, which means the relative value of getting attack from artifacts goes down. Okay, so this video ended up becoming a lot longer than I intended, so let me just do a quick summary right here. The Raiden Shogun's best weapon is of course her signature weapon, Engulfing Lightning, but the difference between that and the Catch R5 is actually pretty negligible. At the same time, if you are using the Raiden Shogun and you don't have the Catch R5, make sure you get it as soon as possible. It is really that good. The Raiden Shogun's best artifact set is the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate set. Nothing really comes close, so if you are a Raiden main, make sure you are hitting up Momoji Dyed Court. Raiden's best constellation is her C2, giving her a roughly 40 to 45% damage boost, and her C3 is also worth a mention, giving her a 15 to 20% damage boost. Her best all-around team is probably the Raiden Shogun Hypercarry team, which consists of Raiden herself, Kujou Sara, preferably at Constellation 6, Bennett, and Kazuha. And finally, if you are going to use her in this team, make sure you get her a lot of crit rate and a lot of energy recharge. So that is it for the guide. But if you guys want to know about something that I didn't cover, or if you have any questions about something that I did talk about, or even if you have anything to add yourself, then please remember to do so in the comment section. I always love chatting with you guys down there. But for now, I hope that all of you go out and enjoy your newly pulled Raiden Shogun, and I will see you folks in the next video.